Hello. Hello, everybody. We might get going. I'd like to welcome you all here today, the people in the room and also the much larger audience who are watching us on Zoom. It's great to have you here. I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to thank the City of Sydney, who have been very kind in helping support us with this, and of course the State Library, without whom it wouldn't be possible. Thanks very much for attending today. We weren't actually sure if we'd have a live BAD this year. This is our fourth year because of COVID, and as you can see, we can only have a limited number of people in the rooms, but members of our audience from past years urged us to go ahead, and we're very glad we did. Just a bit of housekeeping. Feel free to share us on social media, thanks, at Bad Crime Sydney, hashtag Bad Crime Sydney. We're going to talk for about 40 minutes and then I'll ask questions, and I'll be inviting people who are watching us on Zoom to send in questions too, which would be great. We're very privileged to have two former detectives with us today. Ian Lynch worked in the homicide squad for 7 years in the 90s. He then went on to do other homicide work before becoming a trainer of detectives, and he retired 2 years ago with the rank of Detective Superintendent. Duncan McNab, who's been a good friend of the festival for 3 years now, has been here before. He's a former detective. He's also a distinguished author of true crime books, including the definitive biography of Roger Rogerson, and most recently a book called The Snapshot Killer, about an extraordinarily destructive Australian serial killer in the US. And Duncan's also researched and produced some of Australia's best true crime TV. So can you join me please in welcoming them? I guess the key point today is to ask these two gentlemen to help us answer the question that I know many of us have when we're watching a crime series on TV or reading a book, which is simply, just how real is this? And I suspect the answer often is not very. Duncan, Ian, I think we'll start with a murder. Let's imagine that there's a hypothetical murder. But just taking a step back, Ian, these days New South Wales has a central homicide squad, I think deals with most murders across the state.
That's right, yes.
Yeah. What sort of people, I mean, some people call it the elite squad in the New South Wales Police Force. I don't know if you agree with that, but what sort of detectives are there in terms of both their experience and even their qualities of character?
I think the first thing that's required of a homicide detective is a sense of dedication.
Sorry, can you hold it just a bit closer?
Oh, sorry, a sense of dedication to the particular role. It's a investigation type like no other, because you don't have a complainant statement. Instead, your complainant is effectively an exhibit. So you really have to start from square one with regards to these things. You know something has happened to someone, but you don't know effectively how it's happened. And that's what it's all about. And there's no one there, with the exception of witnesses and physical evidence and other evidence, to help you get to the answers to what's occurred. So dedication is, the most appropriate. And of course, with the centralised homicide squad now, you're dealing with matters on a state basis. So at any time, if you're on standby, you're expected to drop everything, get in the car, go to the airport, go to wherever you have to go, and move and be there for as long as it takes. So in terms of your private life, your family life, that's all disrupted. And of course, given the nature of the system we have, you need a level of experience. You can't afford to make mistakes in these investigations. Society has a level of expectation about the work you do that says it's got to be the best. So you're not just dedicated in terms of giving your all to the job, but you've got to show a level of dedication beforehand. And it's also very good to have people with experience in other squads or a lot of local area command experience, so that they sort of know where they're walking into. There are courses to help you get through it, into that initial phase, but it falls on a level of, being able to know what to do and being able to know when to do it in a timely way and to do it properly.
Thanks. Duncan, sort of a different aspect of the same question. In fiction, there's always a certain, I wouldn't use the word romance, a purity almost about homicide work. You have Harry Bosch who speaks for the dead and that sort of thing. and other cops historically might have been corrupt or had their problems, but our normal portrayal of homicide work is that it's very pure, dedicated, it has the resources, it's black and white almost. Is that how it is in practice too, compared with other police work?
It tends to be the case. No, and it also depends on which piece of fiction you're reading or which piece of television you're watching. My favourite, and always sticks with me, and I may have mentioned this to you once before, if you really want to see complete and utter farce, I recommend CSI Miami. My favourite moment in this, and I watch it every now and then just to remind me how bloody awful this series is. There's this red-headed person who I can't stand. I think his name is David Caruso, who I would actually happily kill myself with my bare hands. There's been a series of murders in Miami. He and his colleague, who are crime scene people who for some reason arrest people and question them. I don't know how that happened, but they do. They're all armed, which when I was a kid wasn't quite how it worked either. They're chasing a bloke down a jetty in Miami. Visually looks fantastic, expensive yachts, Miami, very classy, very stylish. And on the end of the jetty is an esky, which allegedly has a bomb in it. So what does David Caruso and his mate do? They don't clear anyone out of the way. They don't call the bomb squad. They don't call for police to back them up to make sure everyone's secure. No, he runs down to the esky and puts his ear on it to see if it's ticking. And at that stage, unfortunately, it didn't blow up, but so that's high farce. Look, a lot of fictionalized detectives are reasonably well done. Some authors quite often give you a bell. One of the joys of this life is you get to talk to them and they say, can this work the way it has? And honestly, actually, a UK writer rang me the other day, and this is something that you and I might remember. She was talking to me about, she's written a fictional character, a detective investigating crimes in Sydney. She's in London. Interesting. She hasn't been to Sydney. So she's writing a fictional story about a detective working out of a local police station, which happens to be the old CIB in the Remington Centre in Liverpool Street. And she's explaining it to me and how a body is dumped on a railway siding that no one sees under a viaduct in Redfern. I said, none of this works. If an Australian reader reads this, they're going to be laughing a lot because it doesn't make sense. So then we went through how she constructed her story. And one thing that I'm always moderately obsessed by in police work and in representation in fiction is the geography. Get the geography right so you can then bring the story into the correct parts of the geography. So after about an hour and a half on the phone, she's rejigged the character so it makes sense that how police procedures work makes sense. Nothing annoys me more than to read a fiction book, and there are a couple of recently released ones that I can't finish because the procedures are wrong. This happens, that happens, that happens. I said, no, it doesn't. And there's one out recently set in the 60s, and it is so procedurally wrong, it annoys me. And it doesn't make a lot of sense practically either. For someone without my background reading it, they're going to think, oh yeah, maybe. For me, I just think, come on, spend an extra hour and get your research right. So it's hit and miss.
It is hit and miss. Ian, let's imagine someone's discovered a body. This is in reality now, and they've called 000. The local uniformed officers have turned up, and a decision has been made to call in homicide. You arrive on the scene from homicide. Can you just talk us through what happens over the next hour or two? What's in your mind as you approach the scene, and where does it go from there?
The first thing you hope for as you approach the scene is that the scene has been handled correctly. The only reason someone has to walk into a crime scene, well, a policeman anyway, or an ambulance officer, is to see if the person's still alive and to see if some sort of assistance can be rendered. If that has already been determined that they're not alive, at that particular point in time, that crime scene is sacrosanct. It's just got to be guarded. Anyone that goes, so you immediately are establishing perimeters around that particular scene. You have an internal perimeter, and anyone that goes through that perimeter, their names are monitored. The time they went in there is covered as well. How you go about that is often dependent upon the types of surface and the actual scene you have. Got to think of hazards, shiny floors, for example, large blood stains, people leaving their footprints in blood stains. That's occurred. It's happened to me before. And then you're also establishing, you're on the, it soon gets out that this sort of thing has occurred. The media will still be there, soon be there. There'll be crowds of people coming around. You've got to establish what we also call as an outer perimeter. And that is, if the inner perimeter is to stop people from coming in, the outer perimeter is to stop people For example, being able to see the crime scene. I had one case once where that hadn't been done correctly. There were 9 bullets that had been fired. Each bullet had a marker, and lo and behold, the next day in the paper, everyone knew the person who had been shot 9 times. That sort of material you don't want. So you have an area for your media. You have an area for vehicles to come in and leave, if you can, ideally. You're also looking for secondary crime scenes, often where the body is not actually where the offences occurred. So you're looking for those things as well. You want to get your resources. You want to get your people in. You want to get people in that you know, hopefully, and you can trust. And based on what you're seeing, you start a canvas. And that's covering that area around the immediate vicinity to see what people have seen and seen what people have heard. And get that done in an organised way. Make sure all your notes are taken. The occupants of the various houses are there, because later on, again, dependent upon the circumstances of where you are, these are people you'll be going back to for witness statements. You might have eyewitnesses, you want to get them covered straight away. So they'd be my principal concerns as you'd start. It all starts with that particular scene. I'd say about 70% of homicides start that way. The other 30% is, where's Joe? It's someone that's disappeared. And that's a different scenario.
And I know it's impossible to be too general, but how long might you spend at a crime scene when you're first called out there?
Some crime scenes are very, very dynamic and things are happening all the time. And you are there telling people what to do and carrying out inquiries because you have a strong lead. Armed robbery is one that comes to mind at the White Horse Hotel some years ago at St Peters, where there was a car registration number. There was a domestic occurring a few suburbs away, and these people were arguing about why did you kill that person. There's a whole lot of things happening at the scene, and although you haven't done everything with the scene, you've got a pretty strong lead as to what's occurred here, and you're pushing things over into that particular direction as well. So as a crime scene, in that case, the crime scene was almost, I won't say secondary, it's still got to be done properly, but your mind is on other things aside from just what you've got in your immediate front. Other crime scenes are very emotional. I went to the murder of a nurse at Walgett many years ago, Sandra Hall, and she was engaged to a local constable of police, and she'd been raped, virtually sort of beheaded, and dumped on an ant's nest near the airport. And all the police there had a very, very strong emotional side of the scene. And the first job when my workmate and I arrived there was to control the local police, to keep them off the thing. And that was a very, very difficult scene simply because of her association with the police in the town, and also because there were a lot of fractures that suddenly occurred with the community up there, given the suspects turned out to be Indigenous, and a lot of the locals were saying that almost straight away. And, you know, that was a particularly emotional scene. On another occasion, I searched a house and found a body in a suitcase after looking for some clothing, after this fellow's wife had been murdered a few weeks earlier. Again, you know, what's a crime scene like? I can tell you that was probably personally my most emotional crime scene. You know, it really varies. Another one that comes to mind, Dr. Victor Chang. Now, that was a particularly difficult crime scene because it got out straight away that Dr. Chang was the victim. And the number of politicians, the number of very important people either coming to the scene or wanting to know what had occurred, the location right off Military Road, the crowds of people that came along. Again, a very, very unique, and also the fact that the principal offender has dropped his wallet at the scene. There are a whole lot of complications in that. You know, no crime scene is very often ideal. You know, there's always things to work out. But that's a difficult question, I'd have to say, Michael. And as I say, it really just depends upon who and how and where the person is being killed.
Yeah. I imagine everyone's different. Duncan, you were mentioning the other day that we haven't always been so good, the police, at preserving crime scenes, have they?
No, just listening to Ian describe how it's done these days. Back when I was a child, things were somewhat different. And it reminded me of the first murder I went to was the so-called senior man, because I was the only one around. Basically, there were two of us on that weekend, so it was a lottery. Mona Vale, 1981, Hay Street. I still remember the guy turning up that afternoon. The uniformed coppers from Collaroy. Now, the Northern Beaches aren't terribly vigorous, although there are quite a number of murders out there, surprisingly enough, for a very genteel part of Sydney. Uniformed blokes from Collaroy ring us up. We've got a body up here. Maybe you should come and have a look. Fine. That's how often it started in these days. So you hop in the car. We drove up to Hay Street, Collaroy. And outside in the driveway of the house, and it was an old, back in those days, you could actually still have a beach shack in Collaroy. So it was a bit of fibro, a bit of weatherboard, fairly run down, grass was unkempt. Single bloke in his 60s lived there. Neighbours liked him. Neighbours had called out because they'd seen his front door open, but they hadn't seen him for a couple of days. Car was still in the driveway. Unusual. So the uniformed police had turned up, wandered inside, had a look around, and there was the gentleman concerned, face down on a rug in the living room beside his lounge. They were somewhat concerned because the front door was open. So alarm bells very wisely went off with them. That's where things went slightly pear-shaped, because when we got there were about 3 different police cars with uniformed coppers in them coming to have a look. There was a highway patrol bloke there on a bike for reasons I still can never fathom, simply because it was interesting to go and have a look at. We turned up, walked into the house. The blokes outside had obviously been to the local takeaway, so they were having a burger and a smoke and a can of Coke. The bizarre thing inside that got me was when we walked through the front door, and back in those days, detectives, the best training you could ever get was to keep your hands in your pockets. That was about as far as it went. No gloves, no DNA, nothing like that at all. And a camera, if you were lucky, from the scientific bloke. So we wander inside, and there are 2 uniformed coppers sitting on the couch, the dead bodies on the floor. They're having a burger, they're having a can of Coke, and they're smoking. We had a short, sharp discussion about all that. They'd been there for about half an hour waiting for us to turn up, so God knows what they'd touched. Anyway, we got them out of the house, and afterwards I said, hey, have you had a look around the house? Oh, no, we wouldn't. No. Their fingerprints were everywhere. So my mate and I are looking at the body, hands in our pockets, thinking we have to take our hands out of our pockets because we've got to find out. He was obviously very dead, by the way. That was quite conspicuous. And it was early summer, so process was taking place. So how you could actually have a burger and chips with a dead body that was getting slightly fragrant still confounds me. So we decided very reasonably to take a shoulder each very carefully and just roll him back slightly to see. And as we rolled him back slightly, there was obviously a bullet hole through his chest. So we pulled him back down again, walked outside, and then called the cavalry, which is when the local forensic bloke turned up. He was in Chatswood, so that was about an hour's wait. The government medical officer on that weekend turned up to certify the person was dead, which is how that worked in those days, even though it was bleedingly obvious. Then back to the police station and await the arrival of the homicide squad. Scene was properly secured by uniformed police who were told not to go anywhere. And we started a canvass of the neighbourhood as well to see if anything turned up, which fortunately an astute neighbour had actually noticed a car outside they'd been a bit leery about and taken a couple of digits and forgotten the rest, which 72 hours later we did arrest somebody, which also wasn't a huge success because I was standing at the door with a homicide squad bloke, Des Johnson. Des and I are standing at the door. We've got guns somewhere, whatever. The SWAS team, the brand spanking new tactical people who are really brand new. We hadn't seen them before, big shotguns and all that sort of stuff. Des and I have got big ballpoint pens and notebooks. The command is given without telling us. We go flying through the door first. Des and I are flat on the floor. 3 very confused looking blokes is looking up from the couch, and then SWAS pour in and everyone gets arrested. So things have fortunately changed. Yeah.
They are never perfect. I went to a murder scene once and we decided, I'd heard about this stuff called luminol, which basically responds to proteins in blood and glows in the dark. And it was a confusing scene. He'd been there for some time. He'd been mostly bashed, but also stabbed. And there was blood everywhere. And again, this is one of the problems of a central homicide. Other people had been there. The body had been removed by the time we arrived. And luminol goes in, and suddenly there were the most enormous set of footprints I've ever seen. going around this house to various places. And we thought that was extraordinary. And we looked around, and there were some links with motorcycle groups. And I'm seeing this big pair of boots, and I'm saying, I think this is looking really good. I think this is looking really good. And then the crime scene came back, and a crime scene officer came into the room with the biggest feet I have ever seen in my entire life.
It solved that one. Most of us are used to seeing fairly complicated murders because you need a complicated murder to fill an hour's TV or a book. But in reality, Ian, how many are solved relatively quickly, by which I mean once you get an idea of the crime scene and all the individuals involved, you kind of got an idea of who it is within, 6 or 12 hours. I mean, what proportion can be sorted out like that? Even if you don't actually make an arrest within that period, how many are there where you have a pretty good idea what's going on fairly soon?
They say there's 3 motives for murder. Mike Hagan used to say that in his investigation of major crime. Greed, lust and revenge. And often when you go to a scene, you mightn't solve it for a little while, but it can become fairly obvious. There's some very obvious leads straight away with regards to what people say. So before you have any suspects, it's always very, very good to commit to paper those people who are first on the scene or the next of kin, so that you can corroborate the issues that they say straight away. Now, that does happen, what proportion of times? The vast majority of killers with those 3 motivations in play know the person they killed. There's very few people that kill someone they don't know. So there are a lot of domestic homicides. They become fairly obvious given the nature of the conditions of the body. There are certain motivations that can become very prevalent with regards to how a body is treated. I went to one at Gladesville once where 2 prostitutes had been murdered, and one had been shot twice, the other one had been shot about, I don't know how many times, bashed, stabbed, and clearly very clear that she was there was something very, very personal in that. And ultimately, I think his name was Lindsay, an ambulance driver, had committed the crime, but the wife of the body that was very, very badly bashed, the husband of the woman that was very, very badly bashed, ultimately went to jail for life, but with it too. So proportionally, I don't know. We used to have in my days about 120 murders a year. That has come down to as low as 90 and 60 at years. Guns may have made a difference to that, changes in gun legislation. But given the current situation with all the shootings out southwest, I'd suggest a lot of the murders this particular year don't fit that criteria. And often you don't read about those husband and wife and domestic ones. They just occur. I think they're saying, was it 1 woman a week dies in domestic violence in Australia? So I don't know when I read my last domestic violence murder, really. They don't attract as much publicity, but they do occur. And often for those matters, those smoking gun type things, the homicide squad isn't informed. It's dealt with locally. Homicide might make a review of it, but it's done at a local level.
We often read that when detectives are looking at a crime, they look at motive, means and opportunity. They're the 3 things. Is that how it works, or is that a bit simplistic?
Motive isn't a proof of homicide, but I've heard in my time a lot of accounts from jurors that think it's a very, very important part of the indictment. A motive is helpful, very helpful if you're going before a jury, but it's not absolutely necessary. Opportunity is something that you generally find during your later inquiries that opportunity is presented. Generally, not always. It depends on the nature of the scenario you're giving. What was your other one? Means,
I think.
Means. yes, that can be an issue. Again, with the drop in the number of guns now that are generally used in homicides, you know, knives and these types of things become, you know, a lot more prevalent in them. When someone's bashed to death, you're looking at the physical capabilities of the person that of the suspect that you're dealing with. That can become very important for some homicides. Some people who you might treat as a suspect would be incapable of committing the injuries that you see have been inflicted to the victim. I would be more happy with a clean scene and a well-controlled event and a well-coordinated response and having confidence. If you've got those things, these other things just become part of the normal account. In every homicide, and it's always the case of a good homicide, we have a running sheet, which it's basically a plan of the investigation that you've done and the things that you've done. It's putting it into some sort of chronology. And you've got to get as much as that done. You've got to cover all that immediate stuff in 3 to 4 days, because after that people start to forget. And old detectives always say about a running sheet, if you haven't named the suspect in the first 3 pages, there's something wrong. So very often, and that in my experience is so very, very often the case. If those first 3 days, there are differences, especially, as I say, where a offender is not acquainted in the normal way with the victim. They are far more difficult. But in a good running sheet, if everything's done right, that name will appear in those first few pages of your running sheet, and those issues that you alluded to all become pretty prevalent from there.
Duncan, I want to talk about forensics, but we've only got limited time, of course. So just one way of approaching the tip of this iceberg, what are some of the big developments in the last 30 or 40 years that have really helped the police?
The single largest step forward was the arrival of DNA in the mid-80s, which we adopted quite slowly. And one of the curiosities too about investigations is, once you've got to court, you've then got to prove the case in court, which is a whole new level of pain for both the victims' families, and the coppers involved as well. Because once you've got a result as an arrest, you've then got to spend 2 or 3 years getting it through the courts, having everything you've done tested by people who are being paid quite often a very large amount of money and are extraordinarily capable to do so. So everything you do is forensically reviewed by them. But the forensics have changed everything very much. The arrival of DNA in the late 80s, which came through. DNA, whilst it's portrayed as being the magic bullet in so many pieces of fiction we read, it's a remarkable tool, but it doesn't replace good, solid, meticulous investigation work. And I think I've noticed an assumption with journalists particularly that, oh, I've got DNA, it's fixed. Think again. The science is as good as, it's remarkable science, but it's how the DNA got to where it's found is the tricky part. And I sat through a cross-examination 3 years ago in a case, curious enough, a bombing case up at Belrose. And the QC acting for the accused did a remarkable job of sowing so much doubt in the mind of the jury that the DNA found at the scene on certain little tiny microscopic snippets wasn't necessarily placed there by the person who was sitting in the dock being charged with the crime. So whilst it's remarkable, it's not exactly bulletproof itself. The science is wonderful, but it's actually how it's transferred there. And I think it might bounce back into colder cases as well, where the police have meticulously kept the crime scene exhibits going back years. I mean, the New South Wales Police still have some of the Wanda Beach exhibits from 11th of January 1965, and they've kept them in the hope that something will be yielded eventually from them. But then comes a question of handling. And again, Wanda is an example of what goes wrong. And it's not the New South Wales Police Force in this case. It's one of the analytical laboratories. They have one slide left, which contains a sample of the Wanda Beach offender. and it's got lost. So that's part of the problem. And likewise, as we saw recently, if you were following the Claremont trial in Western Australia, there was a lot of the trial came down to forensic evidence with the fibres in place, which is a slightly older science, and was the DNA intact. Had it been perfectly maintained? Now, Western Australia, unfortunately, has a reputation until quite recently of the forensic laboratory not handling some of their exhibits badly. There's a bloke I wrote about 2 years ago. He's sitting at home quietly on a Saturday afternoon having a can of beer watching the football. Coppers burst through the door, say, "Congratulations, you're nicked for killing the pedophile down the road." And he had absolutely no idea what's going on. He was in custody for about 2 years awaiting trial. Door opens one day, July 2019. Door opens. Bloke steps through the door and says, "Mate, sorry, we've made a bit of a mistake. You're free to go." And so poor old Ernie goes home, still none the wiser. What turned out as they examined all the DNA is that he'd given a DNA sample when arrested for a couple of driving offences, and somehow in the laboratory, his DNA had got mingled with DNA from the crime scene down the road. A complete stuff up. So that's where there are problems with it. That said, in a couple of years ago, building on DNA, we've got this remarkable step forward, and it's literally just beginning in New South Wales too, is using genetic genealogy to take the DNA, go into the genetic databases, which some of you've subscribed to. Picture, if you will, you're in the United States, you've gone to ancestry.com to find out more about your family, you've given them a DNA sample, and the result comes back, "By the way, do you know you're related to the Golden State Killer?" Which literally is how this came apart. So then the detectives get involved and they track the family back inch by inch by inch. The first success with this was, I think, last year, before the Golden State Killer. They had a little snippet of DNA. They'd heard about how good the DNA sample was with the Golden State Killer, which was still in progress. The copper had sent it off to the laboratory. He had $5,000 left in his back pocket in his expenses. He thought, "Oh, give it a run." Back it comes. They've identified the family of the person who killed 2 kids 30 years before. And so it was only then a matter of doing some good old-fashioned police work, making sure that the suspect could have been on site at the time, making sure the old basics of police work, time, date, place, geography, was intact. Then they find out that the family actually has a son. Everything links up quite nicely. The son is obviously the killer. They can place the son in the vicinity at the time. So they arrest him. His defence counsel initially thought they were going to give it a run because it was the first time this technology had been used. They go through it, they realise it's over, and he pleads guilty. So the first conviction using a combination of DNA and genetic genealogy has been registered. It's just starting in New South Wales. It could be remarkable for solving some of our old persistent cases that we just haven't got anywhere on. For police, it's just exceptional times. And importantly, finally, the families might just get a little bit of finality. So for everyone, it's just terrific.
And there are other advantages that police have now that they didn't have 50 years ago. I'm thinking of things like CCTV, cameras in general, listening devices, various tracking information, phones. I imagine that means a whole lot more work to be done, but does it mean that you've got a better chance of catching killers now than you would have done 50 years ago?
Definitely. Following on from Duncan's example of DNA, in my last job, I got very interested in the notion of cybercrime. And this notion of digital fingerprints is something that other police forces are going forward with in leaps and bounds. And it's taking us a lot longer, unfortunately, locally, to get there. But for example, if you do a raid in the FBI, if the FBI do a raid, they come in their normal SWAS gear, but they also have a dongle bouncer on their epaulets. And every device they find that's open, they whack one in to keep it live, to keep it going. Phones and everything else. They'll even come in with a generator and make sure that these people can't turn the power off so that they can get to those things. If you can get to a person's router, a router has volatile memory in it. And even if you're erasing your history on your devices, your router will still have it with you for a period of time. And the Dutch, in particularly, some police forces in Britain, they're bringing mobile laboratories out now to examine all devices at the scene of the crime. There's no exhibits going back. They are doing it live time. And that's a real, that can be tremendous. I think I saw recently in the Rogerson and McNamara affair that McNamara was found to have Googled how to fire a baby Browning pistol, how they operate 2 or 3 weeks before the murder occurred. And what was the murder weapon? It was a 25 caliber baby Browning. So people are living on their devices. Devices are telling you where they are, what they're doing, what they're thinking. And there can be tremendous things coming out of that as an evidence. And that's something I think we're only just beginning here to come to grips with. But I did Mr. Scipione sent me overseas to look at cybercrime in 2017. I went to the FBI, I went to Washington, New York, over to Holland and the UK. And there are some tremendous opportunities there that we just probably as an organisation aren't mature enough to really start taking that into line. There's huge things there.
Just moving from the future to the past for a moment, because I'm interested in the history of policing. I just want to put a proposition to both of you, and you can agree or disagree. I'd just be interested in your views. We all know that in the past, if you go back 50 years or more, police used to set up criminals, inverted commas, by verbling them or maybe loading them up with weapons. But you had this thing called noble cause corruption, which people are a bit cynical about. But I've talked to some old cops who say, well, we knew someone did it because I had a reliable informer who told me, but I couldn't put that informant in court. I couldn't disclose their evidence. I knew this person had done it. That was the only way I could convict them because I had no evidence at all. Is it the case? I mean, I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying, was there a bit of that in it in the past? And thanks to the developments we've just talked about, would it be fair to say that these days, fortunately, maybe police just don't have to go to those lengths, or they can't go to those lengths?
In the late 90s, mid-90s, the electronic recording of suspect people came in, ERIS machines, and all exchanges with, and the law's changed in accordance to that, all verbal exchanges that a police have with a suspect have to be recorded, and if there are any admissions that are made off the recording, they have to be corroborated on an electric means. So the notion of verbals I'm sure they did occur, but in fact, I'm positive they occurred, but they can't happen anymore with regards to those safeguards. And you now have to, with homicide, if you look at the Royal Commission, there were very, very few police from the homicide squad that were found guilty of misbehaviour. I can think of one, but he wasn't working in homicide at the time. And there was an old adage, there's no money in bloodstained clothing. The offence is too serious. And this is in my experience, every single occurrence is subject to judicial review. If you don't solve it, it's still going to go to the coroner's court, and these things go forever. They last forever. The living victims of homicide never forget. They are always there looking for a solution. And the number of reviews and things that have occurred for homicides, judicial reviews. I'm thinking of that fellow that killed that politician in Cabramatta all those years ago. The number of reviews he's been through. If you're sentencing a person for an offence, life imprisonment, that's a long, long time for most people. And they have a constant stream of litigants, etc., and everyone just cause attempting to knock that out. And silly mistakes like that, silly things like that, just in the field of homicide doesn't occur anymore. You can still be tricky. Nothing wrong with being tricky. But in terms of breaking the law, no.
Things have changed a bit. Yeah. There was a time when, and I remember it vivid, two things come to mind. The first murder I ever did, I was chatting to the murderer in the office, and a detective sergeant came round about an hour later as I've chatted. We're having a lovely chat, getting on quite well. The detective sergeant comes in and says, "Oh, mate, we've got your interview finished." And I thought, how did that happen? Okay. Oh, you don't want to sign it? What a surprise. The other incident, we've been to a murder in beautiful Chatswood on a Saturday afternoon. We'd been washing the cars as police do on weekends. a woman is murdered. We know who did it. It was her son, who had a serious, long history of psychiatric illnesses. He's popped round to see mother and has beaten her across the head a few times with a hammer and then done a runner. We knew where he was going. We followed him down. We arrested him, carted him back to the police station. He's obviously seriously mentally ill. So that's being sorted out. I wandered back into the office, and the divisional detective sergeant, who at that stage was looking after all the north side, is there. He's got a bag full of blood from the crime scene. He's got a pin, and he's flicking it onto the murderer's shoes. And I thought, what are you doing that for? He said, we just have to be sure. But that's what happened back in those days. There was, I can see a point for noble cause corruption when you're absolutely dead set certain, but the bastards outsmarted you. It's time to outsmart them. The problem I had back in those days was not that they were actually doing it. It became too easy. So rather than doing it for the absolute most imperative of reasons, a lot of coppers thought, well, we get away with that one. We'll do it on someone else. And coppers were famous for leaving the CIB, for example, with a bag full of exhibits, which may or may not find their way to a crime scene. I think when the Ananda Marga killers, or the alleged Ananda Marga killers, were arrested, this is so long ago, the police cars leaving the CIB were laden down with bags full of guns and all sorts of shit. Or you'd knock on someone's door and the detective sergeant would throw a bag at him and say, catch. Then you'd arrest them for having the bag of drugs. That's how they did it. And that's not noble cause corruption. That's either expediency, possibly profitability in the case of Roger Rogerson, because he saw an option in getting rid of his competition. So these things did happen. I can understand a reason for noble cause. I can understand a justification for it as well. But it just became too damned easy. So you're doing it for everything. And it was a running joke in the detectives course when I was a kid is, some people actually would write a statement saying, the criminal said to me, you're too good for me, Mr. So-and-so, I give up. That never happens. And to throw a little bit, the courts were also not terribly astute, or they didn't care. The magistrate would sit on the bench and say, yes, Sergeant so-and-so's very honourable man, how could this possibly be wrong? And, they'd be on the terps later on. Of course, everyone knew it was wrong. Everyone knew it was a stitch-up, but it was just how things work. And the crims knew they were going to be loaded as well. But at that top level, you can see a good reason for it, to get some dangerous bastard off the streets. But as a method of just expediency, it's completely and utterly wrong. And that's how the system got so badly screwed up in the 80s that we ended up with things like the Woodrow Commission, which we deserved to get. And the greatest thing I think in policing, aside from DNA, was probably recording interviews from start to finish.
Yeah, it certainly made your job easier. Cross-examination in a court for police just dropped right down. The number of police now that go into contested matters has decreased considerably.
The most eloquent police officer I've ever seen in the witness box was Roger Rogerson. And Roger could create a record of interviews so beautifully that the crim never got to see it. But, he declined to sign it on legal advice at the end. And people would believe that. The juries would be sitting there saying, yes, he's wonderful. And he would command the entire room. Yeah. Even barristers were looking and thinking, this is good. And the judge would be, that's how compelling he was. But most of the times it was just a simple way to deal with an issue, get someone off the street, maybe get a competitor off the street. And it was quite appalling. And that's why we ended up in the dreadful pickle we deserve to end up in, which is resolved post-Wood.
Look, we've got a bit less than 20 minutes to go, so I'm going to ask for questions in a moment, and that includes questions from anyone on Zoom. You can use the Q&A function if you'd like to put a question in now. I'll just ask Ian one more question before we go to questions from the audience. Interviews, Ian, any general advice as to how you approach an interview? Because I imagine you think about them a lot in advance, and I'm thinking of an interview with a suspect. Any memorable interviews in your experience?
Oh, God, memorable interviews. Yes, extraordinary memorable interviews. There are a number of rules about interviewing that people aren't aware of. Just because the solicitor says my client does not want to answer any questions, ultimately it's something that rests with the client. There's case law where people have received that advice, despite the advice, have answered questions that they might think have completely not connected with the offence, such as money's lying around in the case of a drug dealer without drugs, and that stuff gets in. and I don't think police utilise interviewing the way they should. There's another strange thing in the legal process which is also a very effective means when it comes to interviewing. In our legal system, a lie is any utterance made by an accused that can be used to their detriment. So if you can corroborate a lie in a seemingly exculpatory statement, that statement suddenly becomes very, very important, because the question always arises, why is that person lying to the police for such a serious matter? So many of the interviews I've conducted, Leonard comes to mind. He was the fellow that killed Dempsey and the taxi driver at Collaroy, and he was a psychopath. In that first interview, he told me he was not going to basically answer the questions. Well, he would answer the questions in terms of yes and no, but he said a whole lot of things in that which I was able to later disprove, and probably contributed later to him coming back and making admissions of a kind, certainly admissions relative to the deaths of the two people. He still tried to keep himself out of it to a point in terms of drugs and other motivations. But the interview process is far more useful to police. And it's, again, another thing I find is, you know, in terms of the training, something they don't utilise as much, given the nature of what an admission is in our system. It's something that is useful in ways that are far more unforeseen as a direct admission. You don't need a direct admission in an interview for it to be useful. In terms of structure, were you interested in that? We use a model called PEACE. That's the acronym, which is very trendy. It's basically preparation, explanation to the person with regards to what you're on about, their account of what's happening, a conclusion, and then an evaluation. And your evaluation is all about what are the things you've got to do post-interview. The mistake of so many junior police is to have a list of questions, reel them all out, and not listen to what is actually coming back as a response. It's important to ask the question, but it's important to put them into the context of what the person is telling you that you're speaking to. And that's another mistake with regards to omissions, for example, or things that couldn't be accounted for. That's a really, really important part of interviewing. In terms of the basic structure, it's introduction, who you are, allegation, what you're investigating, a caution. You have to caution a person if you believe they're a suspect in terms of what they're doing. A little part there we have called Do You Agree?, where you corroborate all the things that have occurred between you and the suspect since you first met. And the importance of that is obviously when you're being cross-examined in court, you have your suspect, the person who's not guilty of the offence and saying you're doing all the wrong things, corroborating everything you've said in their interview. Then you get their account of what's occurred and you don't interrupt that. Then you re-examine them on that particular account, asking questions relative to the particulars of it and any little details that may have come up from your inquiry, and then you're concluding. And then the evaluation, again, very important. What else should I have asked? But most importantly, given the responses I've received, what do I do now? And there are other aspects to it now as well. There's a psychological component to it. Counter-terrorism are very good at doing this. Make a assessment of the person you're going to interview. In one case, they had a particular, in relation to that army base, I think, a macho alpha male type suspect. Well, you put the two most diminutive detectives to do the interview. And what does an alpha male do in a situation like that and trying to express his superiority of all those around him? He says stupid things, he gets overconfident, he's being recorded, he carries on. So there's a psychological component based on the profile of your offender to take into account when you're going to do those things. Setting the room up, the language you use, the way you ask your questions. If you don't know something, and you know the person you're speaking to does, you've got to be careful with the way you phrase your questions. and don't push individuals too hard, too quickly. Yeah, you're the friend until such time as it's too late for them.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm sure you could talk about the stories behind some of that advice for hours. But anyway, over to you, the audience. Is there a question here, please? Yep.
How do you follow a particular case and to its conclusion, or do you then get involved in the interim with some other case as well, and how do you prioritise?
Okay, I'm sorry, I've just got to ask the question so that our Zoom friends can hear it. The question, I think, is when you're working on a case, do you just work through it to the conclusion, or do you have to work multiple cases at once?
You'll generally have 3 to 4 clear days. If you're on call, you will be touching on a matter, you'll be commencing something, then there might be another call and you're on call for a week and you're off. If you're making big progress with the matter you're doing, you might be able to get someone to fill in for you. But invariably, a homicide detective, there's I think only about 60 of them in the main homicide squad now, you're carrying multiple cases. Yeah, definitely. I don't know of anyone that's been able to have the, if you can do that, but even when you go from, scene to arrest, invariably there's a lot of work to do afterwards, as Duncan was alluding to earlier, in putting together a brief of evidence. And in that time, you're invariably dragged off to something else. You've still got other things on the books you're dealing with. And a trial, if you have a trial, try getting 100 people together in the middle of another matter. Yeah, there's always something else to do.
We've had a lot of very specific questions coming in from Zoom about specific cases or hypothetical cases. I'm not sure if anyone out there is planning anything, but here's a general one, Duncan, which it may be too technical. It's the question from Kathy is, what forensic imaging is effective, for example, in concrete? Forensic imaging, do you know what that is?
I've got a rough idea. And curiously enough, I was talking to the civil engineers professional body only recently about something along these lines. We were talking about Juanita Nielsen, one of the most tantalising cases I've ever seen in this city, 1974, 75, protests up in King's Cross. Juanita is working with the unions, trying to have that dreadful development of which part of which is still up there stopped. Juanita disappears completely. She's last seen in Abe Saffron's Carousel Club selling advertising space. A couple of theories pop up in the years that followed. One, that she went out to Botany Bay or the airport, which is always very popular in Sydney. I mean, if the number of dead bodies out there that you heard rumours of is extraordinary. Few are true. Or that she was dumped somewhere nearby. That she was dumped in the Blue Mountains at the Hydro Majestic. That was another popular one because they found her handbag on one of the Western highways. And the most popular one, and the one I quite like, is that she was dropped into the foundations of the building she was planning to stop. So I spoke to the Council of Civil Engineers, and they tell me that there is a way to actually X-ray concrete to see if there's something in it. And we did this just as a curiosity with soil. In Adelaide when we were looking for the Beaumonts, and we didn't find them. There is a way to actually X-ray or ground penetrating radar to look through concrete, not dissimilar to looking through soil, although slightly more complex. And as a curiosity for anyone who's fascinated in the Nielsen case like I am, they tell me that you actually can drop a body into certain parts of a major building construction and be safe that no one will see it before the concrete pour because it's in such a remote location. And as the body begins to decompose, the likelihood of it causing a structural issue within the concrete is very minor. That's my useful.
Thanks for that, Duncan.
Sorry about that, yeah.
Is there another question from in the room? Yeah.
With the proliferation of crime series, be it fictional or non-fiction, do you feel, especially an example, someone's thrown into Bootham Park, they've got their mobile phone and they've gone, right, we're tracking them, we know where they are. Would not the perpetrator of the crime now disperse him to dispose of the person's phone because you can't track them? Do these crime scenes assist the perpetrators?
Sorry, you're saying that someone could throw a phone away if they were killing someone? Is that right?
Yeah. When you say on the program to see them tracking someone by their phone, that the person that's in the booth saying they've been attacked or whatever. So is a potential perpetrator benefiting from some serious, yeah.
I think luckily the vast majority of offenders out there aren't Moriartys. There's a lot of cops that don't make the level of Sherlock Holmes, but stupidity knows no bounds. To work together also with the obvious heightened state of emotions for most people when they're involved in the abduction or killing of someone as well. Yeah, crooks make a lot of mistakes. Yeah, it's not a brains trust.
Just as I was chatting to a possibly former Danger Prize winner only recently, and he said to me, mate, you'd have to be out of your mind these days to try and commit a crime. The electronic stuff will get you every time.
A question from Peter on Zoom. Duncan, to what extent, in your experience, can you trust witnesses, including eyewitnesses? You know, on TV or whatever, if someone says they saw something, normally that's accepted as a piece of evidence. How often does it turn out to be that they just made a genuine mistake?
First criminal defence I ever did after leaving the coppers was a somewhat notorious case, and we proved that everything the eyewitnesses had allegedly eyewitnessed they hadn't seen because the crime hadn't actually happened. So that's the most extreme circumstance I've ever seen. This is when, back in the 80s, there were child abuse cases with ritual satanic stuff and all this sort of nonsense. And we had eyewitnesses saying, I saw a baby being sacrificed. And they were decent, honourable, smart people. They had just gone into this strange panic. It happened in Australia, it happened in the US on 2 incidents, and it happened in Cambridge in the UK. So the broad answer is eyewitnesses are, in my experience anyway, usually pretty good for a while. And as Ian was saying earlier, after about 3 days, the eyewitness starts to dilute, your memory dilutes. I've got things I can remember with utter clarity from 30 years ago, and I'm wrong. And I think I'm right. And I now challenge myself on it because I then go back to notes, photographs, all that sort of stuff. So eyewitnesses are wonderful, but memories fail. People, there's always that running joke, you know, I saw so-and-so, and everyone's seen the same man at the same time. They all have different descriptions, what he was wearing, how tall he was, what his physical shape was. You'll get some things right first time. Quite often, I know back in the old days in policing, if they had a large scar and that was conspicuous, that was something you could rely on. But you're looking at things like, what colour car was it? Oh, it was white. Oh, it was beige. Oh, it was yellow. And everyone's seen the same thing at the same time, but how much detail you absorb and how accurate that detail that you absorb is where the problem comes in. And as time moves along, that memory becomes more complicated. Back in that child abuse case, we did something curious because none of it was making sense. So we went through every witness and we did a wheel, or almost like a wheel, it was a wheel actually, and we analysed how many times they'd been interviewed by police, by psychologists and by social workers and so on and so forth. And we took their description of the crime that they were alleging from the first interview down to the last interview. And it was utterly different. Some of these poor kids had been interviewed 8 or 9 times. Then in the middle of a trial, we get copies. We subpoenaed everything, and the coppers got really shitty with us, which happens in most cases, by the way, whether it be civil or otherwise, when you start subpoenaing everything. And they finally agreed to the subpoena, and they brought in everything in a box, and they'd literally thrown all the exhibits into this big box that had a TV set in it. So we ferreted through it, and we found a cassette tape. And the cassette tape we didn't know about, and the coppers had actually got a hypnotherapist to interview a child. And we listened to the interview with the child, and it was not a case of what did you see, it's a case of you saw. And that's where the whole thing pivoted. It was done with the best of possible reasons, but the child's memory became so corrupted by the investigation, and the parents likewise. If you have open and closed questions, if it's an open question, you've got a better chance of getting a result. If you ask them closed questions and ask them often enough, people will start agreeing with you. And if you're a person in authority and you ask a closed question, chances are they'll eventually start nodding. And that's what happens. And that's where
open-ended questions are important.
We're almost out of time, I'm afraid, but Ian, would you like to make a final comment on the reliability of eyewitnesses?
I'll give a case study. The one I spoke earlier about where I found the body in the suitcase. The body in the suitcase was the girlfriend of a fellow the death of whose wife, or the discovery of whose wife's body, we were investigating. She was found buried at Berry Island at Wollstonecraft. And the forensic pathologist initially said that she'd been missing for 4 days, or she'd been in the ground for 4 days, which I thought it was based on a little bit of evidence that we had at the time, but really hadn't been corroborated. And the accused was saying his wife had disappeared 17 days ago. I remember it was the night that Cocoon, The Return, had shown on TV. And we had 6 witnesses, and one was a Catholic nun who said they had seen this woman between the time she had died, which was the night of, as it turned out, the Cocoon, The Return had shown on TV. That was the day she was murdered at home. We had 6 witnesses that said they had seen her alive between the time, the 17 days and the 4 days when we said she must have died. And we gave that account to the court. We took statements from 6 people, and we knew they were wrong because they were mistaking her girlfriend. And even though she was part Aboriginal, she did look, in terms of size and shape, very much like the wife. They hadn't spoken to her, they'd just seen her talking, and they'd assumed that it was the wife that this fellow had been speaking to and not the new girlfriend. And we gave that all in the trial. And the judge said, well, there's 6 people here, including a Catholic nun, who have attempted to do the right thing, but clearly they're wrong. We were able to corroborate everything that this fellow had told us with other events to prove that ultimately the pathologist was wrong and these 6 people were wrong, and the way it had occurred was the way he ultimately admitted was the fact that he'd murdered her on the first occasion and not the second. So people, the eyewitnesses, they can be extraordinarily unreliable, especially if they're seeing something and there's blood and there's confusion and there's gunshots and there's noise and there's the type of event that is occurring that would normally horrify anyone else. And that's why in these investigations, corroboration of anything. As we drove this fellow to do the drive around in the scene, I remember Bill Dawes was the prosecutor. And as we're driving through Crow's Nest, we went past the Crow's Nest Hotel, and he said, you know, I had some beers in that pub. I was chasing down a cousin of mine, and my cousin's name was Green, such and such Green. And I wrote it down in my notebook. I didn't think of corroborating it, but when we went to the trial, Bill Dawes said, did you check that with birth, deaths and certificates? I said, no, I didn't. He did, and it was the cousin. So everything that had been said and that they were arguing about, here's something I didn't even bother chasing up, but couldn't have known in any other way. So yeah, people in the most part want to do the right thing in these things, but they do make mistakes.
We'll have to leave it there, I'm afraid. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much, Ian Lynch, Duncan McNab. Can you join me in thanking them?